Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of the European Conservatives podcast, Brussels and Beyond, a podcast designed to keep you in the loop about the political wheelings and dealings that are happening here in Brussels and in the capitals of Europe. My name is Zoltán Kottas. The witch hunt against members of the previous Conservative government of Poland continues. Polish special services searched the homes of the former Justice Minister and his deputy this week, who are accused of misusing state funds. Donald Tusk's left-wing Liberal government, which came into power in December, has been using the full force of the law to go after his political opponents, the previous ruling party Law and Justice. The government has dismissed the top executives of the public service broadcaster. They jailed 2 opposition members of parliament and have replaced the country's prosecutors. Despite these worrying signs that the law is being misused for political purposes, EU institutions, which regularly lambasted the previous Conservative government for so-called rule of law violations, are not voicing their concerns this time around. Former Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki called the recent raids political revenge. The investigations come at a time of increased political pressure on the government as it faces its first electoral test, with local elections coming up on April the 7th, followed by the European elections on June the 9th. In another sign of the new Polish government's relentless pursuit of the country's opposition, the country's central bank president could be dragged before a special tribunal. The government is accusing Adam Glapiński of unlawfully buying government bonds, misleading accounting, and that the bank cut interest rates a month before the election, which is seen by Donald Tusk as a politically motivated move to benefit the Conservative Law and Justice Party. Former Prime Minister of Poland and currently a member of the European Parliament, Beata Szydło, told my colleague Thomas O'Reilly that the harassment of the Polish central bank is purely politically motivated and has no factual or legal basis. In his financial assessment of the situation, my colleague Sven R. Larsson writes that the National Bank of Poland's decisions on monetary policy should be assumed to be independent. Any accusation that it failed to maintain its policy independence and instead acted dependently will have to be proven by the Tusk government using economic theory and a wealth of statistics, but it is easy to show that no such evidence exists. The Tusk government's accusations are baseless, and if it goes ahead with its attacks, that will not only destroy the central bank's reputability, but also shatter its status as a sovereign monetary authority. Speaking of politically motivated witch hunts, the European Parliament officially submitted its lawsuit to the European Court of Justice against the European Commission over its unblocking of 10 billion euros of EU funds owed to Hungary. The 10 billion euros are roughly 1/3 of Hungary's cohesion and pandemic recovery funds frozen for alleged rule of law violations. They were set to be released after the Commission deemed Hungary's systemic judicial reforms sufficient for strengthening the country's judicial independence. However, leftist and centre-right members of the European Parliament claim that Hungarian reforms are still not enough. Hungary argues that the Parliament is engaging in a witch hunt with the sole objective of keeping the funds away from Hungary's Conservative government indefinitely, regardless of any reforms. Displaying the double standards that are commonplace within EU institutions, the EU has recently moved to unblock over 100 billion euros of Poland's similarly frozen funds almost immediately after the Liberal coalition took power in Warsaw. Funds are being unblocked on merely the promise of completing reforms in the future. On Tuesday, the European Commission released a lengthy document instructing social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and TikTok to increase their efforts during election periods to monitor the content being uploaded by its users. The EU's so-called Digital Services Act of last year already forces social media platforms and search engines to remove illegal and harmful content in Europe, but now with the EU elections and a dozen national ones coming up, Brussels wants to ensure that every company knows what its duty is. The EU's new guidelines demand that platforms set up their own expert teams and employ professional fact-checkers. My colleague Tamás Orbán has recently taken a look at the so-called fact-checkers of Facebook's parent company Meta, who are paid millions to remove content that they deem harmful. It is no surprise that a vast majority of Meta's partners demonstrate substantial leftist bias, such as German journalist organization Corrective, which is funded by the left-wing German government, or the Czech Demagogue organization, which has received funds from George Soros's Open Society Foundation. Europeans should brace themselves that the measures implemented by the EU will likely be used to justify the widespread, politically motivated abuse in the name of democracy. Western European nations have successfully imported the ethnic rivalry between Turks and Kurds, which is now playing out on the streets of Belgium. Rival gangs of Turkish and Kurdish immigrants clashed this week in the city of Ghent, as well as the capital Brussels. My colleague Thomas O'Reilly has been reporting about these events. Thomas, what exactly happened in these cities?
Yeah, so we're recording this podcast on Thursday. Well, the incident that seems to have sparked this wave of sectarian clashes appears to have happened on Sunday in the eastern municipality of Houston-Zolder. Information is sketchy. These communities live in a sort of information ghetto of themselves, but what appears to have kicked the bucket on this recent round of rioting appears to be a returning band of Syrian Kurds displaying PKK flags in a Turkish neighborhood. The PKK, as you may know, is a Kurdish paramilitary that the Turkish government is actively suppressing in the east of the country. If you recall, the insistent demand by the Turks regarding Swedish NATO membership was to purge any PKK affiliates within Sweden before Sweden is allowed into NATO. But yes, the PKK has an active presence in Belgium. In the early 2000s, they were referred to as having camps in the country. Belgium and indeed Brussels is a very divided city. In the north of the city, you have a very large Turkish ghetto, and living alongside that is a very active Turkish and Kurdish communities. But what appears to have happened is the Swedish family who were flying the flags on their return home to the east of the country, they were set upon. There was what appears to be an attempted arson attack on a house full of Kurds. You had roaming bands of Turkish gangs. There's a strong indication that the Grey Wolves ultranationalist organization took a lead. Some of the Kurdish groups I spoke to have alleged that the Turkish government has a direct hand in sort of engineering these riots. But yes, primarily in the east of the country, you saw Belgian security forces sweep in to protect mosques and various cultural centers. You've seen attacks in Brussels. You've seen some terrible footage of local Kurdish youths being kidnapped, and you even sort of reports of gunfire. But not the first time that Brussels has seen this kind of intercommunal spat. Just last month we had Moroccans and Algerian gangs fighting, and before that we had Congolese political factions firebombing each other. This is all happening in the shadow of the EU right now.
It's quite incredible that these types of fights are happening right here in the capital of Europe, in the capital of Belgium. How have Belgian officials reacted to the latest such occurrences?
Yeah, so Belgian authorities convened a national security meeting yesterday. Not just this recent spate of sectarian violence. Belgium and Brussels specifically is dealing with a rising tide of narco-terrorism. Anyone living in the city can't help but see the sort of crystal meth use exploding. This is reminiscent of problems that are already seeing in sort of Antwerp. But we have this kind of layer of sectarian violence that's just adding to this kind of worsening security situation. But certainly you can't but help see hear the sirens. This is reminiscent of last month's gang violence between Moroccan and Algerian gangs. I saw myself, there are marauding gangs of Turks. If you can believe social media, they plan to go on the offensive tomorrow and Saturday. We've seen footage of gangs on both sides smash up cultural centers and cafes belonging to each group. But really, Belgian authorities are somewhat leaving them go at it. There's a sort of thinking that what happens in the ghetto stays in the ghetto. But anyone on the ground in these areas must realize that the state is gradually ceding power to these mixture of narco gangs and ethnic mafias. And all happening meters, not just from where we're recording this podcast, but meters from where EU leaders are meeting or regularly meet.
Yeah, so it's not just the ghettos that they live in. It's all over the city now. So as you mentioned, there could be some more clashes are expected or are planned by these groups we've been talking about. What have you heard?
Yeah, obviously there's a bit of a language and information ghetto that these groups are in, but certainly monitoring the communities, at least online, there appears to be a planned Turkish offensive in the north of the city. You've seen social media posts by armed Turkish militants making the sort of infamous gang sign relating to the Grey Wolves. But there's a plan. There are ongoing plans to sort of keep up the offensive on the Kurdish community, smash up cultural centers. But yeah, no, it's a very different city that one would expect. As I said, you've seen various journalists here in Belgium point the finger at sort of the Turkish government in playing a hand in these protests. President Erdogan himself actually phoned up, rang one of the teenage victims of the recent sectarian violence and pledged support. He said Turkish diplomatic officials would take a hand at least monitoring the sectarian riots. But rather famously, Turkey has a strong hand over its diaspora through its state funding of mosques and cultural groups. But yeah, it's the city very much feels up for play. It's not a binary between Flems and Wallonians anymore. It's a very sad and stark warning for where Western Europe seems to be heading.
Thank you, Thomas. Austria, France and Italy have all issued warnings of potential terrorist threats to Europe by the Islamic State following the group's Moscow concert hall attack last week, in which more than 140 people were killed. The French government increased the country's security alert to its highest level, which means more soldiers will be put on standby and ready to patrol sensitive sites, including schools. There will be an increased police presence during the Easter holidays in Austria, especially in places where large crowds are said to gather. Police in Italy will also feature more heavily at popular tourist spots and at so-called sensitive sites. The branch of the Islamic State, which claimed responsibility for the attack in Moscow, is called the Islamic State of Khorasan province, which, according to experts, is one of the most dangerous Islamic terrorist organizations. Recently foiled terror attacks in Europe that can be attributed to this organization were a planned attack on the Swedish parliament, against Christmas markets in Germany, and against the cathedrals of Cologne and Vienna. There are increasing signs that the terror threats facing Europe could once again be coordinated attacks, not the lone wolf type attacks that have been prevalent in recent years. The United Kingdom and the United States have accused China of launching a prolific global campaign of cyber attacks spanning more than a decade and targeting the personal information of politicians, journalists and voters, writes my colleague in London, Michael Curzon. An attack on Britain's Electoral Commission is said to have given Beijing the names and addresses of more than 40 million voters. Western officials say the information gained was intended to help target anti-China groups. They are now considering how to respond to the cyber attack allegations, which Beijing has dismissed as political maneuvering. Ministers are debating whether to declare the Chinese government itself as a threat to British security, but the Foreign Office, headed by China-friendly former Prime Minister David Cameron, has urged the government to act with restraint. The EU is also believed to have been targeted by Chinese cyber attacks. The US Department of Justice issued an indictment on Monday revealing that Chinese hackers have over recent years targeted every European Union member of the so-called Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, an organization that is critical of Beijing. The organization stated that over 1,000 emails to more than 400 unique accounts of individuals associated with the group were attacked in 2021. According to a recent survey published in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung daily, The German Greens, who entered into government with the Social Democrats and the Liberal FDP in December 2021, have seen their support plummet from 18% to 8% compared to 5 years ago. Meanwhile, the number of people who claim not to like the party has risen considerably from 25% to 56%, meaning it is one of the most hated parties in Germany. The results of the survey come as no surprise. The people's trust in the German government has dramatically fallen in the last year, and the policies of the Greens have contributed to that. The government is facing a backlash for its energy policies and green agenda, including the closing of all nuclear power plants, adding to the cost of living crisis. German farmers have been protesting for months against tax hikes and climate policies that endanger their livelihood. The disastrous economy has been coupled with a huge increase of migrants arriving to the country and an aggressive foreign policy led by Green Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. While Social Democratic Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been wary of sending heavy weapons to Ukraine in the country's fight against Russia, Annalena Baerbock has urged and on occasion successfully persuaded the Chancellor in doing just that. Ulfried Geiter, one of the founders of the Green Party, recently announced he is quitting the party after 45 years as a member, citing the Greens' warmongering policies as the main reason. While he had previously been proud to be a member, he can no longer tolerate the foreign policy of Annalena Baerbock, which puts the security of Europe and the world at risk in order to make the Greens themselves feel morally superior. Carles Puigdemont, member of the European Parliament and former president of Catalonia, has announced he will be his party's candidate for the regional elections on May the 12th. In 2017, he was removed from office by the Spanish government following the illegal unilateral Catalan Declaration of Independence. He has been living in self-exile in Brussels ever since. The centre-right government that removed him has since been replaced by the socialist cabinet of Pedro Sánchez, who has relied on Puigdemont's party to form a government. The price Sánchez has to pay to Catalan separatists is granting amnesty to Puigdemont and other Catalan nationalists. Although the Prime Minister believes that the amnesty deal is a way to end the Catalan independence issue, the separatists have made it clear it is the first necessary step in holding another referendum and breaking away from Spain. Puigdemont himself said if he won the elections, he would return to Spain and attend Parliament to form a government, and then he intends to finish the work blocked by Spain's central government in 2017. It is more dangerous to be a farmer in South Africa than to live in Baghdad, Iraq, or in Damascus, Syria, says Jaco Kleinhans, a high-ranking member of the Solidarity Movement, a conservative movement in South Africa. In an interview for the European Conservative, Jaco Kleinhans told us that the murder rate per 100,000 citizens in South Africa is currently the second highest in the world, and that since the end of the apartheid era, 3,000 farmers have been killed in South Africa, mostly accompanied by extreme torture. Political rhetoric and a continuous hateful message towards farmers and white South Africans in general are increasing, and the worst racial laws like affirmative action started under the presidency of Nelson Mandela. As Jaco Kleinhans says, and I quote, "Racism towards black people is always well communicated, but the tremendous increase in racism against whites and the hate crimes and murders against white farmers are dismissed as normal and not as racism." Jaco Kleinhans believes the ANC government in South Africa is increasingly anti-Western. They consider whites in South Africa to be an unwanted remnant of Western colonialism in Africa, and they consider Israel to be an unwanted remnant of the West in the Middle East. In the past 2 years, South Africa has moved closer to Russia, Iran, China, and also terrorist groups such as Hamas. To read this insightful interview, go to europeanconservative.com. And that concludes this episode of Brussels and Beyond. Don't forget to read our magazine, check out our website, subscribe to our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube channels, and watch our monthly TV show, Inside Brussels. Hope you tune in again next week. Have a very good week. Bye-bye.